Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Florida Race Equity Challenge. Today's webinar is Assessing Race Equity in Policy. My name is Ash Baca, and I'll be your moderator for today. I'd like to explain some of the technical aspects of using the GoToWebinar platform. All of our audience members will be muted for today's webinar. If you take a look at the top right corner of your screen, you'll see a control panel with a red arrow button at the top. If you click that arrow, the full control panel will pop out and you'll see a chat box where you can submit any questions for today's speaker or technical issues to our staff. Please feel free to submit questions in the chat box throughout the presentation, as our presenter will be periodically pausing to answer questions from our audience. At the end of the presentation, we will also facilitate as many questions as we have time for today. With that being said, it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Lisa Gary serves as Chief Strategist of Equity in Practice, a consulting group that focuses on eradicating the disparate treatment and marginalized opportunities of youth of color in the juvenile justice, child welfare, education, and mental health public systems. Lisa also serves as the Director of the Office of Equity and Reform in Maryland Department of Juvenile Services. Her role is to shape and guide agency efforts to define, assess, nurture, and cultivate institutional fairness and equity in agency policy and organizational practice. She also provides state-level oversight of reform initiatives in Maryland, such as the Annie E. Casey Foundation's Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative. Lisa has served as a policy director with the Center for Children's Law and Policy in Washington, D.C., where she developed and managed the MacArthur Foundation's Models for Change Disproportionate Minority Contact Action Network. Her work on racial disparities in the juvenile justice system has been recognized by both the MacArthur Foundation and the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Lisa is best known for her bold, passionate advocacy to eliminate the disparate treatment of youth and families of color in the juvenile justice and other child-serving systems, as well as her depth of expertise to help practitioners shift beyond dialogue to actions that strategically and sustainably advance racially equitable outcomes. Please help me welcome Lisa Gary.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you so much, Ash, for that introduction. I am so fortunate to be with you all today. The field of amazing advocates and thought leaders on racial and ethnic disparities in the country has grown exponentially, particularly over the last 1 to 5 years. And so I acknowledge that you could have anyone with you in this space that you've created with intent to address racial and ethnic disparities. And I am so humbled by the fact that you have invited me into this space. Just to give you a little bit of a sense of how I work, my process in this work is really just a combination of my study of some of the work that came before me around racial and ethnic disparities, the mentoring of those who have poured much into me to teach me this work from not only a theoretical perspective, but also a practice perspective. But largely, what informs my work is the experience that I gained from working directly in the belly of the system here in Maryland to actually begin to practice what I preach about, not only the problem of racial and ethnic disparities, but also where our potential solutions lie. And so with that being said, I want you to know that the focus that I use comes from my experience, which is justice. However, a lens of race equity can be applied in any system, whether you're child welfare, mental health, school, law enforcement, community, grassroots, even parent and youth organizations. The whole point of a lens is to teach you and to embed principles of equity into what you do on a day-to-day basis. And so you don't have to be in justice to pursue this model. You just have to have a heart to be just in order to do the model. And so what I usually do before the virtual COVID-19 platform, I usually get a sense, I usually show up present and physical in a space to present. But because we're virtual, I can't do what I usually do. And that's usually to ask people for a show of hands in terms of who they are. So I can get a sense of who's in the room. You know who I am, but I would like to know who you are from the perspective of your influence on decision making. And so if you can turn your attention to the screen, Ash is going to walk you through doing a poll. The poll is open. to get a sense of who you are and your decision making. Understanding that decision making is not solely for those persons who sit at the top of organizations, who are the agency leaders, who are appointed leaders, political leaders, but we all make decisions. And so it's very important to understand how you show up in decision making regardless of your role. So I'm going to ask you to answer that poll, and shortly we'll have your responses. It's important to understand that as we talk about the lens of equity, it's anything that you do, no matter what your job is, you are applying a lens. It's just like glasses. And so how you see a thing determines and guides your response to a thing. So I don't know, Ash, if we're ready for poll results.
Absolutely. So Lisa, we had 41% of our respondents saying that they regularly influence policies and practices. We have 34% saying occasionally, 16% saying rarely, and 9% saying never.
90% saying never. Okay, well, this is a really good place to start. Thank you, Ash. Because if you've never done it, then now you know how to do it when you begin. And by the close of this particular presentation, hopefully you will understand what that work looks like. So I love this quote. Maybe we are searching among the branches for what only appears in the roots. The reason why this is so important, because the work around race equity, I like to see it as tree work, because our focus, particularly around justice reform, is on the branches, what we can see, the things that are readily discerned or experienced. But what it also does, it can be overwhelming when we see police violence, when we see everything that we've seen on the news recently about racialized outcomes, racial incidents. It really does become a focus. So we try to figure out, how can we resolve this violence? How can we do X, Y, Z? How can we stop these things from happening? But the truth of the matter is that the work exists at the root, or as my grandmother used to say, the root of a thing. When we talk about the roots, we're talking about where the work takes place in terms of understanding underlying causes of a thing. So yes, we can have on the branches a series of incidents of racialized violence against people and communities of color, but the work of equity must not only seek to reduce that, but it must address and confront and actually repair what is happening in the root to make that behavior or that response even possible. And so it's not an either or, it's a both. You have to prune your tree while at the same time examining your roots and making sure that they're healthy. And so our usual focus is around racial and ethnic disparities. We look at racist actions and ideals that lead to racialized outcomes. A deeper focus, however, should be upon structural barriers that create, perpetuate, sustain, reinforce, and uphold racial and ethnic inequities. So again, it's okay to see and want to be concerned and focus on the outcomes of racial and ethnic disparities, but the response in terms of our lens and thereby our action lies at the roots of the matter. So just some quick learning objectives really quickly. 4 things today, really simple. The groundwork for equitable practice, the purpose of a lens, the factors that go into designing or constructing a lens, and then the application of the lens. Those are the 4 learning objectives that I have for the webinar today. So groundwork. Groundwork is essentially being grounded in the work of race equity is achieved when we become intentional, when we become strategic, when we become even sustainable in equitable practice. It's not by chance. It's not a fluke. It's not because you arrived there, all of a sudden we had to take a different direction, and it has had an impact on youth and families of color who experience the system a certain way. If you're not designing it so that they experience with the system or an organization is different, that's arriving at race equity by fluke. That means it's not sustainable. I'm gonna give you an example. We had to make a lot of changes in Maryland, where I am the racial and ethnic disparities director for the Department of Juvenile Services, and COVID required us to consider the safety of our kids in placement. as well as our staff. And so we made a lot of shifts to send a lot of kids home with the resources they need for continued community-based supervision, whether that be Wi-Fi and hotspots and devices. We also saw the juvenile court made a statement about looking beyond just youth risk in order to look at the child and family more holistically, so that juvenile court judges and magistrates would also begin to see a home-based, community-based placement better than facility-based placement. So that change all actually reduced the overrepresentation, i.e. the number of Black and brown children in secure correctional placement. We saw a 60% reduction between March and June of this year because of COVID-19, but it wasn't intentional. And so my work right now is to figure out, how do we sustain this space? How do we keep this thinking about looking at kids and families holistically, as opposed to just looking at one factor and then detaining them on the basis of that factor. And so again, when we look at our groundwork, we need to understand what that work is and why we do it, from a purpose of being strategic, being intentional, being effective, and being sustainable long term. And so I love this graphic. This graphic is not new in our field. I think I've seen this 1,000 times, but I think it's the best model of what the work around race equity is. And so, again, equality is the first one. Everyone receives the same thing. It promotes fairness and justice by giving everyone the same thing. Equity, however, gives people access to the same opportunities, but it changes something because it gives them what they need to access those opportunities. So it's a matter of fairness. Justice, however, is concerned about access in terms of how you actually get to the game. And so justice is having the systemic barrier removed. And in this instance, in this illustration, that is defense. I always tell my colleagues around race equity that the work around justice, the work around trying to get to measurable results, that's removing that fence. So today we're going to talk a lot about what that fence dismantling looks like. So the work of racial equity is a combination of all three. Yes, there are some things that all kids and families who we serve in our system and in your system, they receive some of the same things, the opportunity to that service. They also must receive what they need to maximize their participation in that service. That's the equity or the fairness principle. But we must also understand that race equity in America in particular is based upon a historic stronghold of structural, systemic oppression and marginalization of people of color. And so in order to really have justice, we must understand how they have been kept within certain parameters, i.e. the fence, and how do we remove some of those obstructions so that they will have access without all the need for all the additional material and opportunities, such as those 2 boxes. And so I love to be able to break racism down into 4 levels. This applies to any system that you may be working in, any organization that you may be working on. It's not mine. It's adapted from the work of a brilliant, so I think she's an anthropologist, Dr. Valerie Betts. And so it breaks levels of racism into 4 independent levels, but they are interconnected. Personal, that includes your values, beliefs, feelings, attitudes, and opinions. Interpersonal, your actions, behaviors, treatment, relationships, and language. Culture, collective views that establish or reflect norms, the climate, shared values, unwritten rules, public opinion, and group dynamic. And the 4th being institutional, rules, laws, policies, procedures, and systems. These 4 levels all reflect some form or opportunity for racism to be practiced, to be embraced, to be tolerated, and to be institutionalized. And just to give you a really quick example, because the 4 of those together create what we know as structural racism. It is a systemic concept, not an independent act of meanness. It's structural. And so if I have a value, belief, or feeling or attitude about a particular racial or ethnic group, then my interpersonal interactions with them will be one that likely reflects my values and beliefs and feelings and attitudes, especially if they are adverse. My treatment of them, my behavior, my actions toward them, and my relationships, even my language toward them would be one that is adversarial, hostile, and non-tolerant. Culturally, I may then find a whole community of people who share the same perspective that I have, my adverse bias against this particular group. And so if I find a community to connect with culturally who actually reinforces and normalizes my isms, my biases, my prejudices, my stereotypes, and then so it kind of gives it life and it begins to justify it. It begins to give it a space to operate. It becomes something that's a shared opinion, not just my opinion, which also makes me feel better about holding that ism in my mind and heart. What happens is that when we are talking about system operations, systems are a combination of rules, laws, policies, procedures. And it's important to understand that people make decisions using whatever filters that they have. And so our isms become institutionalized because we then filter that into either the formation of rules, laws, policies, and procedures and systems, or in the implementation of rules, laws, policies, and procedures. So if I have, from the example I gave, all my isms, my personal belief, me acting it out interpersonally, me finding a community where it can be seated and verified and validated and supported culturally, and then I have the opportunity to work in a system or in an organization, and I must make a decision that can influence or impact the life of a youth or family of color. That ism will come up in either how I create policy, how I interpret and then practice policy, my organizational practices. And so it's not one or other, one thing that we address and ignore the others. You must walk and chew bubblegum at all times on race equity to address the four simultaneously and understanding that. So today's presentation is going to talk about if these are the levels of racism, then the change must take place in these levels. That's why you can't implicit bias train your way to equity. Because that will implicit bias is a real phenomenon and problem in personal isms, but it's not the only factor in structural racism. And so you can have people who are transforming and making all kinds of aha moments personally, but then what about what has already been embedded in our culture? In our language, in our relationships, and more importantly, in our institutions. And so while we have these levels of racism, we also have the same levels of change. This is where the work around equity can and must take place. Transforming your personal values, beliefs, and feelings. This is why you can do some training and some building and some reconciliation and consensus building and some mediation circles to begin to give people an opportunity to transform their personal opinions. But then you also must set standards for their interpersonal. There must be codes of conduct, things that are deemed appropriate and things that are deemed inappropriate. Then we must also challenge and shape culture, which means that we must begin to change the norms, the climate, revisit, re-examine, and hold ourselves accountable to a better value, a better standard, better unwritten rules, and public opinion, as well as begin to reform our institutions. That means how do we make changes in our rules, laws, policies, procedures, and systems. So then when we think about the topic of the day in terms of the lens of equity, the lens of equity focuses on advancing work that hits all four of these. Most times all together. And when I do some demonstrations of the use of our race equity lens, then I'll have an opportunity to point out what particular level of ism is being addressed. So in understanding what is race equity, if I had an opportunity to sit in a room with you all and say, what is race equity, I am likely to get 234 people here, 234 different responses. So to make it a little easy for you today, I am using the Annie E. Casey's Foundation, their Embracing Equity definition, and that is racial equity is the state, quality, or ideal of being just, of being impartial, and being fair. It's the state, quality, or ideal. In other words, it is both a destination and a journey. It is a standard. It is the blue ribbon of justice. That's what race equity is. It is, we get there in stages. And one of the things that I am very sensitive to, I would love to see us become a racially equitable society while I am still here on earth, but I may not see it in terms or concepts that I want to see it. I may not see some of the advancement that I want to see it. So I think there are some generations that have planted seed. There are some generations that water seed, and there are other generations that reap and sow seed, and then it repeats itself again. And so understanding where we sit in the work right now in 2020, we are in a wonderful place of not only planting and watering, we're also beginning to reap and harvest seeds of equity because we understand that we want something that is just, we want something that is impartial, and we want something that is fair in decision making and the treatment of communities of color, both racial and ethnic groups. And so race equity work requires three intentions. The first, to shift from urgency to readiness to working. Urgency and readiness are two different states of emergency. Urgency is we need to do, we need to desperately do. Readiness is we have a willingness and an agreement to do. And then working is we're going to hold ourselves accountable to what we agree to do. And so where are you in the work? I want to give you some thought. You don't have to answer in the chat unless you want to, but I want you to begin to think about where are you in your system, in your organization, in your community. Where are you seated right now in the work? Are you in a place of urgency where people are urgently concerned about the state of racial and ethnic disparities? Are you in a state of readiness, which means that we have gotten together, we have some agreement among key stakeholders, and we are ready to address this issue with boots on the ground and real strategy? Or are you at a stage of working and that we have, based upon our agreements, we are ready to do X, Y, Z because we believe this is what will achieve race equity. This is what will begin to advance race equity in our organization or in our system or our company. Also, you need to be able to name and confront the various levels of racism. The slides I just presented. When you are not willing to call a thing, you cannot do this work. You cannot just say, call racism implicit bias. That is an aspect. That is not the problem with racism. You need to be able to call a thing, and you have to develop comfortability with talking about race, not only within groups, but across groups. It's not enough for all the people of color in your organization to be able to engage in conversational dialogue about race and racism and race equity. You must have everyone able to have a comfort level and an opportunity to discuss racism and racialized outcomes. When things happened with George Floyd and back in May, what happened was a shift in the number of people who were talking explicitly about not implicit bias, but and not about violence in his neighborhood. The conversation was about the ism. It was about racism. And that's when we start seeing movement. So that's another intention that you must have to begin to do this work. And then third, you must be able to acknowledge the role and presence of whiteness and systemic power. I always struggle with this, not because it's not anything valid to it, but I want to take my time to explain to you what that is, because it's the most misunderstood term. We've had a lot of success recently, and being able to have more comfortability with saying the word whiteness or white privilege. There has been a real evolution of that in our system for us to have this conversation. The presence and role of whiteness is not a group of people. It is not a white male. It is a dominant cultural space. That's all. It's a dominant cultural space. It is purposed to keep others within a margin, i.e. this is the bar, this is the expectation, and all groups must meet this expectation. But the issue with that is that it's expected, just again, back to equality and expecting that everyone starts at the same place. You can't get within a margin that you don't have resources to get into. So the problem with whiteness is not only that it keeps you within the margin as a person or community of color, it also sets the norm to which all others are compared. If you would just do this, if you would just do that, if how many times have you heard that argument? And that's not just from white people. That is really a lot of people who actually buy into this dominant cultural space. So you can even have a system with egregious disparities that are led and solely implemented or predominantly implemented policies by people of color, because you're upholding a standard, you're upholding a cultural space without any type of sensitivity or even consciousness about how that space is not durable, viable, feasible, or even accessible by communities of color for various structural barriers that we're going to discuss a little bit more. But those four levels of the ism and understanding institutional policy, and how that then begins to lock some people out from meeting that, from getting within that margin. And another issue of whiteness that it asserts the normative position of white culture in times of perceived threat more explicitly. In other words, certain slogans are hurtful, but they are intended to, again, assert the dominant cultural space of white people as normative and everything else being abnormal to that space. So that's why a term such as Make America Great Again, there was a group of people who looked like my ancestors for whom it was not really that great. And so when you hear that, you have to understand the trigger. It's a trigger. It is intended to trigger that dominant cultural space. It is intended to trigger persons who need that cultural space to exist in order to validate, affirm, or feel superior in their race over other races. And so again, if you're going to do race equity work, you must be able and willing to explore and to acknowledge first the presence, but then explore the role of whiteness in not only decision making, but also in the structure and formation of institutional policy and practice. So for purpose, when you have a racial impact assessment, is when you're using a race equity lens, you must have some purpose in how you do it, why you're doing it, who does it, when is it done. And so the benefits of a lens is that it ensures routine and timely assessment, anticipation, and prevention of adverse disparate impact of system policy and practice on youth and families of color. Assessment, to be able to assess something. What is this, what potentially will this yield? Anticipate. You have to anticipate that system policy, organizational practice, organizational policy, those things may have a disparate impact on youth and families of color. So you need to be able to anticipate that so that you can shape your response to it. But more importantly, you must be able then to prevent. If it is known, or if you assess and anticipate that there's a disparate impact of organizational policy or practice or even programming on youth and families of color, then you need to be able to do the prevention piece so that you begin to mitigate that. And so, again, it just ensures that you have a lens, you're being intentional in your focus to routinely and timely assess, anticipate, and prevent disparate impact. It also creates opportunities to advance and embed racially equitable principles in the organizational practice. If I go to the doctor and it's determined that I am sick, I don't need him to say, yep, I'm looking at you, and yes, you are sick. Bye-bye. That doesn't help me. I then need him or her to begin to acknowledge what my treatment plan needs to be, what needs to be included. And that's the whole benefit of a lens, not only to see the sickness, but then begin to craft and shape its healing. When we use a lens, we use a lens before we even enact a new policy. Before you start a policy, assess it. Before you enact the policy, assess it. What's its disparate impact? You use it to assess existing policy practice and programs in terms of not only found new policies, what are we doing now that potentially can be driving racial and ethnic disparities and racialized outcomes. I.e., a racialized outcome is anything that is predicted by race, and it is usually adverse to communities of color. Also, to guide policy modifications. If you're going to modify something, you want to do it again through, and I used the example of the doctor with the sickness and the healing. The lens itself should be used to guide and shape our modification, to shape our healing, our treatment program plan, and then also to inform legislative actions. All policies come from law. Law comes from legislative consideration and actions. And so if it's not enough to look at organizational policy and practice, we need to also, again, remember the roots. We're going deeper. What is the birthplace of policy and practice? It happens in our state and federal capital every day. That's legislative action. So if you're going to use a lens, that's where the lens also needs to be applied. What is the disparate impact of this legislative consideration, or this action, or this decision, or this new law? How is it going to affect youth and families of color? One of the things I can tell you, Florida State University does a lot of work around legislative racial impact assessments. Actually, my state is looking at the work of that Florida State University to determine if it's something that we can adopt for our legislative office. And then also, again, to guide reform activities. So many times, you have all these special initiatives in the juvenile justice system. We have this system called the Juvenile Detention Alternatives Initiative from Casey Foundation, which is a set of core strategies. And then one of those core strategies is racial and ethnic disparities. And guess what? It sits right off to the side, just like a little stovepipe. And nothing usually gets done there because everyone that is sitting in this stovepipe, they have the answers, but they have not integrated that with the work of the other committees of reform. So any multidisciplinary collaboratives that you have, everyone should be using a lens of equity so that all of your actions, all of the working objectives and goals of that initiative are met through a race equity lens. And then what to assess, again, legislation and law, policies, practices, residential and community programs, even your funding decisions and your funding structures. We're going to talk a little more about funding decisions because that's important for how communities of color are invited into the space and actually giving an opportunity to serve youth and families of color. Also our budget allocations and our human resources. And any and all potential decision-making that can create or perpetuate racial and ethnic disparities. In other words, if you're going to wear glasses, wear it all day and apply it to everything. And who should use it? Legislators, policymakers, directors, and managers, even your line level staff. So much of our work around reforms is based upon what decision makers and executive level staff, even middle managers, think about what should be done. But how often do we actually ask line level staff to engage with us? Because guess who implements policy? So I always tell people, you have wonderful reform created at the executive table. It breaks down at the line level, because the persons who have to implement were not brought into the room and asked to engage in not only the problem, but also the solution for a thing. And so you cannot forget your line level staff. Community and accountability partners, the same thing. I'm going to talk more about that amount of inclusion, so I'm going to stick a pin in that one. Service providers, grant makers and grantees, and also leadership development. Because if you're going to have a group of people who are going to be the leaders of your organization in the near future, they should be developing and cultivating and practicing use of this lens now so that decision making moving forward is much more equitable racially and ethnically. So let's take some questions, Ash. I know that was a lot, and so let's see if anyone has any questions. And I think you can put them in the chat, and Ash will come up.
Yes. So we did get a couple questions in. The first one is, where are the places that whiteness is most prevalent in the juvenile justice system?
The places where whiteness is most prevalent is everywhere, primarily in court decision making. If you ever read a juvenile justice court order, it is steeped in whiteness. In other words, it means that this child would do, and family will do everything to become part of what is deemed to be normative without the resources and tools to be normative, such as a traditional family structure. I've seen in court orders where it's been ordered that a child develop a relationship with his or her father. And that's not to say all communities of color don't have fathers in the home, but we also know from the data that's a particular challenge, particularly in our poor communities of color. And so the relationship with the father is assumed to be normative of a traditional white family, but that does not mean that that is something that is healthy for their child, that's accessible, and it can bring more trauma than it can healing. And so, well, if you read a court order, you'll begin to see the different standards that speak to the a normative culture that may not necessarily reflect that family's progress and how they define success. So my first question to families is, what is success to you, and how do I get you there? Because that's me being equitable. Not me saying you need to do X, Y, Z to become this type of family, and I need to see you do that actually in 6 to 9 months. So that's where I see that happening the most. You also see it happen in the enforcement of court orders, because we then begin to enforce those same standards in terms, we call them terms and conditions of probation or aftercare. We enforce those same standards on families. And so not only in the formation of treatment goals for a child involved in the juvenile justice system, but also our enforcement of those goals. You have another?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lisa. Let me see here. I believe we can continue. We do have a few other questions, but we could continue the presentation.
Okay, that's fine. So let's talk about some of the factors of a lens. What are some of the, I always like to say lens factors because I think it's a nice eyeglass too. I don't know why I keep thinking about it like that, but the factors of a lens is basically that. If you think about a lens, what's in it? What, you know, if I wear glasses, I wear contacts right now today, but I wear glasses. Been wearing glasses since I was 8 years old. And so depending on my eyesight and what I needed to see and then what my ability to see, my lens was shaped by getting me to see clear. And so what are some of the things that the doctor considered in crafting my lens? It was based upon what he needed to craft a response to my illness of eyesight where I couldn't see. And so when we think about the lens, Casey Foundation, through their 7 steps equity, they actually have a number of things that they propose. They have about 5 or 6 questions that they propose. And if I had to summarize it, those questions in a lens, a racial impact assessment lens would be: who's included? What's the disparate impact? And then what must be done or modified to eliminate or eradicate or address that disparate impact. And so I believe in the same thing, but I just understand it from a different lens. I understand it from practice because I am a practitioner by day. And so the lens that I created has that same focus broken into sections that are readily understood in practice. The first being aim. What's your policy aim? What's the point? Most policies, I won't say most, many policies exist to cover organizations in terms of if we are held accountable for something, we can say we have a policy in place to do that. But for the most part, policies begin to tell us what our house is built of. Policy should reflect our mission and our vision. Policy should exist to say what the outcome is for children. Unfortunately, in many organizations I've had really a pleasure to work with, most policy has been driven towards making sure what we call CYA, cover your you know what. And so when we are looking through a lens of equity, it's important to get to those policies that are intended to have to drive or guide our decision making about children and families, more so than just solely making sure we're covered if it does not go well. So what's the purpose? That's me saying, come in policy. What's your purpose? What do you hope to achieve? And then who's your target? And not only who's your target in terms of youth by race, ethnicity, but also where are you? The policy addresses what part of our system? The entry, the middle, the exit. Understanding that is important because to understand where the policy sits also determines what practices that are associated that we must focus on. So if I have an intake policy that I am actually vetting with my lens, then I know that every intake procedure must also be seen with that same lens. Then you also have inclusion. I'm going to talk more about inclusion, but inclusion is basically the same as Casey. Who's at the table? Not only who's at the table, why are they at the table? Are they at the table with power? Are they at the table with purpose? And then number three, disparity. Pervasive disparities in context and implementation. In other words, when your lens should be looking for documenting inequities. You should be able to use your lens to say, aha, there's one. There's a root of inequity. There's another root of inequity. Oh, here's another one. Because as you begin to dig your policy and your practices and your procedures apart, you begin to understand the pieces that need to be modified and or fixed, or those that need to be completely eliminated. Then you have, and this is where there's a difference in my organization, not only here in Maryland, what I applied here in Maryland, but also equity in practice. One of the things that's so important that many people miss in doing a lens of equity, they do 1, 2, and 3. Most times they miss 4, because 4 is where the work takes place. Those are your opportunities to advance race equity principles. Those are the opportunities to embed principles of equity and organizational culture, organizational practice. Those are the things that when champions like myself and Minnie Bishop and all the juvenile justice coordinators in Florida, when they have gone on to their next place, their next assignments, if you have a race equity principles that are embedded in what you do because you have learned to use a lens and you do it routinely, then it doesn't matter that your advocates shift or change and go away, but you get new advocates who come in, but you are organizationally set to reflect equity because you become what you've been looking at. So I'm giving you an example. We're going to walk through some policies and some practices. I might give you 2 examples. But before we do that, I want to talk about number 1, the policy aim. Again, what does this action, i.e., what does this policy or practice or program, what does it accomplish? Whose decision making is targeted? Because again, that goes back to inclusion. That's not just system decision makers, but if I have an intake policy that I'm looking at, and I know that the policy is set to only engage kids in the juvenile justice system, for example, who should, or who I won't say should, but who actually are in need or have a risk level that requires our services and attention. Then I know my decision making is not only targeting the intake decision maker, it's also targeting another group that's often overlooked in the process, and that's youth and family, because they make decisions too in that process. The decision to show up or not show up at an intake hearing, that is a decision nonetheless. And that decision to not show up actually has more adverse consequences or collateral consequences on decision making at the point of intake. And then which youth population is affected? The level of specificity that you need for this and data collection and analysis is enormous, because you not only need to know their race, their ethnicity, gender, geography, and offense. All those things begin to inform you of the who, and it varies region to region, county to county, decision point by decision point. This is a formula that I gained actually from the W. Hayward Burns Institute. I don't mess with it because it works. Race, ethnicity, gender, geography, offense. Those 5 things tells me everything I need to know about racial and ethnic disparities in terms of the impact, disparate impact. Not necessarily what's causing it, but the disparate impact. We'll talk more about that as I walk through an example of vetting a policy. Inclusion. Point number 1, and this is what I hope you take away the most from this conversation. Inclusion is power with, not power over. Power with community, youth, and families, not power over youth, community, and families. If I ask an organization that I'm working with to describe to me how they, quote unquote, engage youth, how do they engage families, how do you engage community, the number of times that I am told that they're at the table, well, when we're working with a family, we develop the treatment plan and the parent signs off, or the guardian signs off, or the youth signs off. That is not inclusion. That is being dictated to in terms, that's not even asking me what I want to gain from my treatment. That's not even giving me any self-agency for being responsible. Yet you're going to hold me accountable, though, to be all in to something that you didn't include me in terms of its construction. So inclusion is who was consulted on the action. If it's a staff member, in Maryland, we implemented graduated responses. I refused to implement it until staff were at the table, not to sign off, but to construct it. So in Maryland, our graduated response system was created solely by a multidisciplinary group of staff statewide, who have various roles in decision making in terms of kids on supervision, community-based supervision, and aftercare supervision. They were consulted because guess what? They implement And the implementers are the ones who should say whether something does not work, or what is required to make it work. So the question is not only what role they play in constructing an action or policy, or practice, what's their role in implementing and monitoring? Because if you also want them to be at the table, you also want them to play a role so that they take some responsibility for it. And so implementation and training on our graduated responses was done by line level staff. They trained each other. There's a coach in every single regional office that helps the staff walk through graduated responses. And then we monitor, we do reports that are pulled automatically from our system, where they actually hold themselves accountable to their own use of graduated responses as well as incentives. And then also, does this action reflect their needs and their perspectives? And if so, what feedback loop is in place? Nothing is more exasperating than calling youth into a process, for example, and then not letting them know how their insight and comments were taken into consideration, how it shows up in what we actually craft as a policy, practice, or program. That feedback loop is essential to say we're not only just trying to use you, but we want to ensure that what we do is reflected in what you shared with us in terms of what we need to do. So you need to not only engage and include communities that are traditionally left out of the planning room, you also have to have a feedback loop that keeps you accountable. Because if anything, a child would tell you, I have a 17-year-old, I'm sorry. I'm in denial about his age. But I have a 17-year-old who holds me accountable to something that I say. Children will hold you accountable to what you say. And so part of us being inclusive is to also be ready to be asked to be held accountable, to be accountable rather for our actions. And also disparities. That's part number 3. And again, this is just those 4 things I covered. Those are like the bare minimum of what should be in your tool. But disparities: which racial and ethnic groups are most advantaged and how, and which are likely to be the most disadvantaged and how. Knowing how a policy affects one group over another is important. Not only racially, not only ethnically, you may even see regional differences, and that's the difference between a suburban or metropolitan area versus a rural area, because implementation in a rural area looks a lot different based upon the demographic of the kids served, as well as a limitation or fewer resources. And so who's likely to be advantaged and who's likely to be disadvantaged, and how do we mitigate that? And then what evidence of disparate impact exists? What's your data? What does it say? I know that the last session webinar, there's a lot of focus on data. So understanding how you use your data to always or to routinely understand disparate impact and how it shows up, just and recognizing that one is overrepresentation, that's quantitative, that's numerical. Then you have that which is qualitative, and that is how children and families experience the system, and how children and families of color in the juvenile justice system, they experience it a lot differently than their white counterparts who had the same offenses or similar offenses. And so part of our work is not only to change overrepresentation, but also change the treatment and the disparate treatment of children and families in communities of color. And then which levels of racism are implicated or addressed. Remember that personal, interpersonal, cultural, and institutional. Understanding when disparities show up, name it. How much of it is personal? How much of it is interpersonal? How much is cultural and institutional? Because if you can name the level of ism, you can also begin to identify what the solution must entail. And then fourthly, your equity opportunities. This is the piece where the work takes place. If people say, when are we going to stop talking? When are we going to stop talking? Let's get to work. Guess what? It's here. It's at this stage that you begin to understand the work of equity. Any policy, any practice, any program can be leveraged or modified to do 4 things. This is the work of equity. It's really not sexy. It's not complicated. You're either mitigating harm, you're advancing benefits, you are dismantling structural barriers, or you are cultivating inclusion. That is it. That is the work. So the question is, how can this action be leveraged to mitigate, advance, dismantle, and include? Those are the 4 things that I'm always looking for in looking at race equity strategy. And if it's not doing any of these 4 things, I can almost assure you it may be something that makes you feel good, but it is not going to yield a harvest, nothing that's measurable. And can it be Can this actually be replicated across key partner agencies whose decision making intersects with our own? Someone asked in the question section about how whiteness shows up in juvenile justice practice. And so one of the things that we are always sensitive to is that we are a centralized state agency for probation, aftercare. We also run our secure detention facilities and two secure correctional post disposition or committed to custody placements. And we can make all these changes as an organization. You can invest in me. I have a full staff of 8 people who we are all working on race equity and reform. But if our partners, i.e. the juvenile court, the state's attorney's office, our law enforcement partners, our public defender's offices, our schools, and our youth and our families, if we're not working with them, our service providers, to ensure that they are applying the same lens, we are potentially bringing progress only to a certain point. And that is what we solely control. But what about the areas where we cannot control, such as a court order to say, with all due respect, Your Honor, this court order is a problem because it is steeped in pushing a dominant cultural space that this family does not have the resource to obtain. It needs to be that bold of advocacy. It has to be that intentional to not only change your organization, but to make sure your partners are changing too. So as to take some more questions before I do some sample exercises of vetting.
Thank you, Lisa. We do have a few questions that also came in throughout the presentation. The first one is, how do we encourage our leadership to develop and use this lens?
So the question, the answer to that question, I would say, where are they in the room? Are they a part of this discussion? If they're not a part of this discussion, this type of discussion, not necessarily this one, but this type of discussion needs to get to them. That could be asking for a meeting. That could be persons who are marching and protesting right now. You want to see reform in not only policing, you want to see reform in crime and justice. That means coming together to the table, demanding some time at the table that we want to see a lens applied to this. We want a lens applied to legislation. We want a lens applied to how we hire and recruit law enforcement and correctional staff. We want to be able to be at the table when you are planning your policies and practices. That's a means of relationship, but it's also a means of accountability. If you are a community person, if you're a grassroots person, if you are an organizational leader, you can demand time. You can demand that the system for which your tax dollars pay are accountable to you. And that's just inviting them into the room and making sure that this kind of information gets to them, not just to you.
Excellent, thank you. Mm-hmm. And we can do one more question. So how can we begin to build trust to approach and consult with the affected population, particularly families?
Part of that is recognizing it and when you are imposing, again, that dominant cultural space. Most times, families are willing and able to work with us only to the extent that we are willing to bend ourselves and not become power over, but power with. Which means that when we have meetings with family organizations and our community organizations, when are the meetings? Because if it takes place at a time when they're working, it's not for them, it's for us. This virtual format has been so wonderful for us because we have gained so much flexibility even in how we meet and who we're able to meet with. And so now we can exercise the use of technology to broaden our tent. Much of the time, when I think about like even therapists that I work with and their treatment goals, and they become very frustrated working with the families, and like the family won't engage in functional family therapy or multisystemic therapy, that you ask the family if they wanted to engage in that. Now, so, did you ask them if they had another resource with whom they would rather engage? Oh, well, they are very close to their pastor. Well, pastoral counseling is really a thing. People have actual degrees in pastoral counseling. And so we continue to impress and push a dominant cultural thought space and product onto a family that really utilizes non-traditional resources. They utilize things that may not be as traditional but are as effective. One of the ways in that we fail to work with families is that we fail to work with the entire their family. Everything about a court order is about the youth, him or herself. Everything about even a school learning specialist plan, or IEP is what we call them here in Maryland. Is about just the student, but a child and a student is not just a sum product by him or herself. They are a product of a larger community that is their family. That is how their family functions. And so much of our work needs to get grounded and will take uprooted from systemic practice or structural practice and then planted in community-based, community-driven thought, tools, resources, and ideas. So hopefully that answered that question.
Thank you very much, Lisa.
And so the last part, I just want to demonstrate the use of a lens. Some of this is taken from, all of it is taken from actual practice, either in my own state or other states that I've worked with doing racial and ethnic disparities work. And so I want to be able to demonstrate the application of a racial impact assessment lens. No matter where you sit and how you answered that poll, there is a decision, there is a role that you potentially could play or that you could actually show your decision makers to play. And so I want to demonstrate two of these. They do come from the juvenile justice system, but it can be applied to any system once you get a sense of what we're looking at. So this is the home pass policy. This is a group of community case managers who must conduct a home study to ensure safety and well-being of any committed youth released temporarily from secure placement for either on a weekend pass or family event. The home study policy requires a criminal database search of anyone who resides in the home with an arrest record, with potential denial of the pass by the case manager based upon the findings. So again, home pass policy, if the kid is going to be on a temporary weekend or family event pass, a study is conducted to determine is there anyone in the home who lives there or resides there who has an arrest record. And depending on the answer to that, that pass can be denied to you. And so our policy aims in that regard. Our policy aims are to ensure safety, well-being of youth on temporary home pass. The decision is that of the community case manager. And again, the target, this is an example that I came up with. Committed youth in custody. This actually reflects some data from a site that I work with. 94% Black male committed youth in custody. They're overwhelming. They're the leading charge for them, sustained property offenses, felony theft offenses, with a previous history of probation violation. That's the policy. Inclusion. Based upon the recommendation of a case manager from a rural region. This policy was based upon case managers from one particular part of the state where there is a community, one of the neighborhoods in that community had the highest number of kids in the system, but also the highest number of crime. It is a very poor African-American community out of maybe multiple neighborhoods in this one county that is the majority minority population community. And so the idea was that if kids are going back to this community from placement, they may be in harm or they at risk because people in this community tend to have more charges, i.e., not charges, arrests. And so it was based upon the recommendation of a case manager, not because it was data driven. Parent and guardians were not consulted on this policy, and it also excluded public defenders who were made a cogent argument why this was racially and ethnically disparate, why it was actually a form of discrimination based on the composition of that community. Disparities. So as we are doing the lens, looking at the disparities with this home pass policy, there's a non-traditional home structure in many communities of color. In this particular community, it was extremely non-traditional because it was extremely poor. When I say poor, it's in the state, it is the poorest community, which means that you can have multiple generations in one household. You can have multiple generations who have had contact with the police in that same household. And then also the decision was based upon arrests, not convictions. And so if you have communities of color that are excessively policed, those who are overly policed, then you are likely to have more arrests, not necessarily convictions. Those are two different things. So the decision or the policy was based upon whether or not there were more people in this community who had ever been arrested. The answer is absolutely yes. I could just walk into the community and say, anybody who's ever been arrested, raise your hand, and everyone's hand's going up, with the exception of maybe Big Mom. So there's broad use of staff discretion as well. For a case manager to make this type of change in policy arbitrarily, or even to propose it, it would require for a case manager to actually be the decision maker about that, and not having to take it to the court, that child's public defender, even taking it to the state's attorney's office. It was just our decision to broadly use our ism, our personal and interpersonal. Anyone in a home who's ever been arrested is a risk. But what about if they've ever been arrested and even convicted, even jailed? There's no rehabilitation. Is it an indictment for life that there will never be a change in the life of that individual, therefore that community? So that's a broad use of staff discretion, not only their personalism, but also interpersonal. It's disparate treatment. It's a different behavior based on a different community. And then when we look at opportunities, again, looking for an opportunity to use this, because I could just be seated in number 3 and be thoroughly pissed off about it. But to do race equity, I had to push myself to number 4, which are where the opportunities to mitigate, advance, dismantle, and include. And what this was, to mitigate and dismantle, do not enact this policy. This became a policy that we were able to thwart. Like, they could not implement this policy because it was so racially disparate. And then how do we then take this opportunity? It's not just mitigating harm. There are some policies that we just simply should not enact, or those that we simply need to revoke. And again, readiness and working, two different things. Making sure we're ready to do the work, because the work means revoking some things, modifying some things, re-examining some things. But to advance, I can't just sit with, okay, we're not going to enact this policy, but how do we make sure this doesn't happen again? And so the question becomes, how do we do, well, let's say they decided that they wanted to enact it and require a supervisor signature. So they're still going to enact it, but we're going to do a supervisor signature. You need to go a step further. To advance an opportunity that's equitable is that you use a reentry plan to reinforce safety and well-being. So that child has to go back to the community eventually anyway. Let's use this opportunity to test and shape our reentry plan for this youth and this family. And then include, you need to poll public defenders and parents and guardians on home pass protocols. What do you do to them? What kind of drama do you create for them, particularly if you have parents planning for kids to come home, or actually coming home for family events like funerals? We've had, in this particular site, a number of kids who were denied a home pass to attend a funeral of a family member on the basis of this. That is disparate. So that's how you vet that. I'm gonna vet one more. Clock to make sure I keep enough time for questions and answers at the end. Let's look at another policy, a practice change. This was supervision adjustment. So this is the scenario. To prevent youth from being detained due to serious community supervision infractions, the Community Supervision Director enacted a new practice that allows case managers to require youth with supervision violations to report to an evening reporting center for 5 days max. They then return to normal community supervision. This adjustment also followed an increase in parent complaints about youth non-compliant behaviors in the home. So it meant two things: to keep them in the home and to keep them out of detention, and then address their complaints by parents. So in order for kids to stay in the community who have infractions, they will be required to go what is called to an evening reporting center for 5 days max. That's the supervision adjustment that was made by the Community Supervision Director. So in terms of looking at our policy aims, the objective, again, prevent detaining non-compliant community supervision youth. Decision, it was all the decision of the community case manager. In this particular instance, and looking at the target, it was targeting kids who are on community-based supervision. And so in targeting them, we're looking at, it was 88% Black, male and female, both person and property misdemeanor offenses, most in the city region. Again, knowing your target, knowing who a policy affects is very important because the response then must consider the type of offenses, where it's at, that is 88% Black, male, and female kids. And so then we looked at inclusion. Who was included? Community case managers were included in this decision making. This became the product of a focus group with community case managers for graduated responses. And they was trying to figure out for kids who have serious infractions, how can we, since our last response for them is to take them to detention for technical violation until they can get before the court, where they may remain in detention as a result of the court order or the hearing from the judge. How do we go about keeping them in the community? So this particular supervision adjustment was presented and created in response as an equitable response. But even if you have what you deem to be an equitable response, it still needs to be vetted through the lens. And so, again, community case managers came up with it, as well as the evening reporting center staff, in terms of what they could do to serve the population for a 5-day period. Would it be any disruption for bringing a kid into the program just for 5 days? And so parental consent was assumed but not confirmed based on complaints. And so to be more inclusive, what they should have done was have maybe a focus group with some parents and some guardians to kind of get to some of the things they were complaining about in terms of non-compliant behaviors in the home. And then other stakeholders weren't consulted because in Maryland, in particular, we're able to do graduated responses to keep them from going back before the court because of supervision or technical violations. So disparities, one of the things, even though this was created as an equitable policy, the disparities is that supervision youth were 84% youth of color, but 96% of all youth of color, youth who receive infractions. So again, we restate that. Supervision youth are 84% youth of color. But among those who receive infractions, supervision youth, they were 96 youth of color, i.e. there is a clear trend in violating youth of color in the state. Violations are 4 times more likely to occur in our majority minority counties. We have 6 in Maryland that are majority minority counties. And then what's implicated? Personal, interpersonal, cultural, and institutional. All of those things are implicated. Personal biases that may lead to the violation of a youth on probation or some form of community supervision. Interpersonal, being how we treat them, behaviors, attitudes, actions being more harsh with that population. Again, 96% of all infractions are youth of color. No other kids in the state on supervision were cutting up, because if you know teenagers like my teenager, they all cut up from time to time. And then cultural, that reflects organizational culture around kids on supervision, kids who are on probation, and or those who are returning to the community from aftercare. And so a lot of this work around graduate responses is a cultural response. It speaks to what we believe, what our shared values are as an organization, as an agency about kids in supervision. And again, are we enforcing against standards of a dominant cultural space, or are we giving them the resources and tools and the opportunity to demonstrate or create their own sense of what's healthy and what's well for them without any kind of delinquent acts? And then it's institutional because it's policy. This is a change in policy. The supervision adjustment changed institutional practice, and it did so in a way that's really good. But again, this is a part of doing the lens to ensure that we're able to name what is being affected. Because in order to sustain this change, we have to understand that the change happened institutionally as well. And then where are your opportunities? Again, mitigate, advance, dismantle, include. It requires supervisor review for bias or harsh treatment. And so before you can actually even put a kid with this additional requirement for evening reporting center, it had to be signed off by a supervisor to ensure that it was being done in a fair manner. It advances equity by using the evening center program to address non-compliant behaviors or problems, as opposed to detention. It dismantled changes and procedures to prevent detention. And it also was inclusive of what we also wanted to work to be more inclusive of family and youth consent to program engagement and goals. And that's the one piece that was missing. So one of the things we did as one of the opportunities is actually begin to include, we have a youth council in terms of those who kind of tell us what community programming they need. And so how can we actually use the ERC to help you achieve your probation, your larger probation goals, as opposed to just being a punishment. And so again, just because something is either created or presented as an equitable, racially and ethnically equitable policy or practice does not mean it does not get vetted. You must be able to walk through these areas, these 4 areas, at least at a minimum, to kind of talk to get to what your response should be. So that is the demonstration of using a racial impact assessment lens to vet any type of policy change or enactment, any kind of procedural change in enactment. We can even do this for programs. And so with that, any questions or answers? That is the end of my presentation on the lens of equity. I know it was a lot. I would rather see you than be in this space, but I am fortunate to be in this space. We have to use what we have in this season. And so I want to take some questions to make sure that I'm at least addressing some of your concerns or your curiosities about our work.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Lisa. We do have quite a few good questions. We only have time for one question, however. So the question is, how do you ensure that the policy assessment lens is applied in Maryland? And as a two-parter, do multiple state agencies utilize this lens for their policy assessments?
Okay. So the first part is that I ensure that it's done because my unit does it, and that's why it's important for if you're going to embed principles of equity and race equity into your organization, you must have at least a dedicated staff resource that will be responsible not only for doing these activities but keeping the ball rolling and setting a tone or the standard. However, it's not enough just for me to do this. I also ensure, or my team to do it. So I have a full team that vets policy on a regular basis, but we also train our managers and our executive level leaders on the lens of equity. Similar to this, where the last two exercises, we actually have a full 8-hour training of exercises, procedures that we're constantly looking at and teaching them the use of this. So before a policy gets to my team, it has already been vetted and in its construction by an executive level staff or team. And so twofold, we do it, my unit does it because we have a dedicated resource for equity in our agency, but also we teach it as a learned skill for decision makers. And then the second part of that question, can you read the second part again, Ash? I'm sorry.
Do multiple state agencies utilize this lens for their policy assessments?
So the short answer to that is absolutely not. The long answer is we've been working on that for over 2 years. And so our Juvenile Justice Reform Council that Governor Hogan here in Maryland put in place, they are working to see this adopted by multiple agencies. And we also have a legislative impact assessment lens that we actually are adopting from Florida State University to ensure that our legislators are beginning to use a lens. So right now we are working with our juvenile court system on just the language of equity, what is race equity work, in the hopes that they too will begin to look at use of a lens for some of their court policies and practices. But the primary organization that we need to do this work with us to use the same lens is child welfare. And that has not yielded as much fruit as I would like because it's very difficult to get them to the table, or to it's a very large, fragmented, Titanic type of organization. But if they change their policy and they begin to if they begin to vet their policies and practices through this lens, many of the kids who land in the juvenile justice system here in Maryland will not be in our system because they got child welfare cases. Their issues are more of safety and well-being from a mental health child welfare perspective as opposed to delinquency perspective. So it's a work in progress, but it's important that multiple organizations are able to vet the lens with such a lens within those in your multidisciplinary collaboratives. So hopefully that answered that question.
No, thank you very much, Lisa. And on behalf of the audience, I would like to say thank you very much for coming on today and for giving us a presentation on equity and policy. We really appreciate your participation here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Minnie Bishop, and to the Juvenile Justice Coordinators in Florida. I so appreciated spending this time with you today.
So now this webinar transitions us into the Block 2 circuit level debriefs. Between now and September 1st, circuit teams will meet to discuss the information shared during the last 2 webinars, taking a look at your local circuit data with your Justice Reform Coordinator. With this information, you'll be able to begin to understand the what, as Karen Butterfield described in utilizing data, to start investigating the why and developing a work plan leading towards a more equitable juvenile justice system. We hope you will continue to join us as we move forward to Block 3, Changing the System. The next live webinar session will take place on Wednesday, September 2nd, discussing changing our lens, healing relationships through restorative practices. Thank you all very much and have a wonderful day.